Marc Dunkelman, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. So pleased to be here.
So, you have a new entrant in the long litany of free word question book titles. How nations fail, why democracies die, but yours is actually somehow particularly snappy. I feel like it's become a little bit of a meme, and some of these book titles aren't. Try to be snappy and ask an interesting question and fail. But yours, I think, asked a question that did immediately grab me when I saw it, which is why nothing works. What do you mean by that? Why do you think that nothing works?
Well, I think there's a sense, particularly on the center left, and probably across the country as a whole, across the electorate, that government doesn't function the way we intend it to. The book generated from my noticing at one point when I was commuting into Penn Station and reading this famous book, The Power Broker, which I assume many of your listeners will know, which was the story of Robert Moses, who reshaped...
I'm sure all of my listeners have it on the bookshelf, and few of them have actually read every page of it.
Fair enough. They should read. Every page is beautifully written, and the stories are rendered incredibly well. But the story of it is this one guy who just got an incredible amount of stuff done, reshaping the landscape of New York City over the course of 40 years, named Robert Moses. And he just did it, with precision and alacrity that was remarkable. And I was commuting into Penn Station probably 20 years after I'd gone to school in New York, and I'd remembered going to school in New York, reading articles in the New York Times and the New York Post about how Penn Station was about to be redone, and here we were 20 years later, and the station still hadn't been redone. And there's this famous quote from Vin Scully, who was an architecture professor at Yale, that we once entered the city like emperors when the original Penn Station had been erected. It was erected in the first decade of the 20th century and then demolished in favor of Madison Square Garden and an office building in the 60s. And he said, we once entered like emperors, and now we enter like rats. And that's how it felt. It's a subterranean station with a warren of halls. It is the second most heavily trafficked transit hub in the country. There was almost no political opposition to building a better station. But despite Robert Moses having been able to do things that everyone said stop to, a half century earlier, now we had a station and like a piece of public infrastructure that everyone acknowledged was terrible, and yet nobody seemed to be able to get it done. And that sparked this question for me, and I realized that you could see this pattern across the whole of American public life. We can't build high-speed rail. We can't build housing. We can't build clean energy facilities. We can't connect the clean energy that we would get from those facilities to the grid. We just can't do things. And I began to wonder, maybe in the case of Penn Station, my initial thought was, well, maybe it's that the owners of Madison Square Garden, which now sit atop it, are sort of a boulder that can't be removed. But then I realized that there was something systematic going on. And so this book is my attempt to understand systematically what has happened to make it so that nothing works.
And I think that obviously the title is evocative because we all do immediately have an association of that. I remember first thinking that when I was, still, I think, in first year of university, and I would visit my mother in Karlsruhe in Germany on a regular basis, and they were moving a tram stop close to our house. And, it took them about a year to move this tram stop, which is a very simple structure. It's kind of like a bus shelter, from one side of a road to another side of the road. And during that time, we went for my first time visiting there to Beijing, to China. And we sort of arrived, at a place where we were staying on this, very simple 2-lane road. And, it sounds like a made-up story, but 2.5 weeks later, we drove to the airport on a 6-lane urban highway, and we'd watched them build this, in the course of these weeks. And, of course, there was a period of time in American history when the speed of development was similarly fast. I forget exactly. I think the Empire State Building was built one story a day or something like that, and it was just erected in an an incredibly fast manner. And today you do have this feeling of stuckness.
Yeah.
You have this feeling of you want to erect high speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco, where it would make a lot of sense. And it's blocked in part by environmental regulation, even though obviously high speed rail would be very friendly to the environment compared to the alternatives of having to drive or taking a plane. I was struck by the fact that, going from Boston to Washington, D.C. should take about 2.5 hours on a train if we had trains that were equivalents of the ones that France has built with the TGV. It should be an hour and change to get from New York to either Boston or Washington, D.C. And it's about 4 times as much as that. And more broadly, there's a sense that we don't really have ambitious projects in public life anymore. Whenever you have a book about public policy, you run into what I've called the chapter 10 problem, right? Where in the first 9 chapters, you sort of describe the problem very well, and then the 10th chapter either says we have to change everything, and you read it and you think, okay, but it's not going to happen, or it ends up futzing around at the corners, and you say, all right, fine, perhaps we can make some of that happen, but it's not actually going to solve the underlying problem. So why do you think that not just the United States, but other developed economies, other liberal democracies like Germany, are stuck in the same problem? Why is it that nothing works?
So the way I would describe it, or the way that I would try to answer that question, is to go back in history to a moment where, after the Depression and after the Second World War, there was a notion that big institutions, at least in the West, were largely trustworthy institutions. And we really placed faith in the wisdom of quote-unquote great men. You could sort of produce a mental image of them if you think about this, sort of in a gray suit with a fedora and a frown and their arms crossed and taking very serious decisions. And there was, certainly in the United States, sort of a sense that these men who had seen us through the Depression and the war were worthy of our esteem, and that we could trust them to make big decisions. And so we created institutions that gave them the discretion to accomplish major things. And so the quintessential example in my mind of this is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is sort of, because it's regional, it's given sort of short shrift in the lexicon of powerful bureaucracies. But David Lilienthal, who was effectively the dictator of this bureaucracy in the Upper South, which is a region of the country roughly the size of England, and was incredibly poor at the time, was given this mandate by the federal government to build dams and electrify poor farms and create reservoirs and reforest areas that had been seen soil erosion. And there was no substantive check on his power. He was just able to do it, and he hired federal workers to do it. This was not some collection of the federal government is going to give some money to the state of Tennessee or the state of Alabama or the state of Kentucky and suggest a way that the money might be used. He hired his own workers, a federal workforce, and they just remade this huge portion of the country. And that was indicative of a governing approach that sort of vested itself in all sorts of ways. The Marshall Plan was later called the TVA for Europe. During the Vietnam War, there was going to be a TVA for the Mekong Delta. And Roosevelt actually imagined that the TVA, and having sort of a public power authority that had sort of redevelopment authority, his view of what public agencies and public authority could do and the role that it would play in the economy. He was a capitalist, but when people labeled him a socialist, there was a reason, right? He really wanted these big public bureaucracies to take charge, and that was what defined progressivism in that era. This notion of the big bureaucracy that had a lot of discretionary power.
So there's a sense of the word progressive comes from we want to achieve progress, and we're going to do that by using the power of the state to do big projects, and that is what it is to be on the left in some sense.
Yes, and so and exactly the notion was power as it's distributed in the early 20th century, before the New Deal, before the Great Depression, is too diffuse, too dispersed. There are problems. We can't figure out ways to build the big sewer system our city needs because the machines are too powerful or the corporate interests won't let us. We need to vest power in publicly minded men who will do these things, solving various tragedies of the common. That was the mentality. And then in the 1960s, sort of beginning with C. Wright Mills and his description of the power elite in the late 50s, and then you see it certainly on the left in the Port Huron Statement and Students for a Democratic Society, and sort of rising through the counterculture and into the protests of the 1968 convention, is a totally different idea. And the idea is the problem is not that power is too dispersed and that's preventing us from doing big things. The problem is that power is too concentrated in these big bureaucracies, and that they have created these monsters like Robert Moses in New York, like Richard Daley in Chicago. And you see sort of within progressivism, and sort of by some sense across the ideological spectrum, a countervailing movement against concentrated power. And it's cultural. It's not just it's not just in the world of politics. It's not just people are like the movie Chinatown is about a powerful guy who's stealing water from the valley outside of Los Angeles and giving it to the city, right? The tagline of the movie Network, which comes out in the mid-'70s, is "I'm mad as hell and I won't take it anymore." And that statement is directed at the quote-unquote establishment, which becomes sort of a meme in and of itself. The sort of notion that there is some collection of extremely powerful figures who sit in a back room, whether it's smoke-filled or not, and make decisions. And the notion that you can't fight City Hall, which is sort of a phrase that we use, was never meant to suggest that you couldn't unseat an incumbent mayor. That happens all the time. It was that there was some powerful force behind the mayor, and that no matter who was sitting in that chair, they were going to get to build the development that they wanted or move the road that they wanted.
And just as a side note, what's interesting about this is that what you're describing is a theory of a deep state. And at the time, it was really the left and the wing of this new progressive movement that saw itself as fighting the establishment in the deep state. And in some ways, those roles have today inversed.
You're absolutely right. Like the establishment was an idea that emerges as and the establishment had been good, right? The New Deal and Great Society imagined this powerful bureaucracy as a force for good, that we could solve any problem. We could, you look at John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, that was a big bureaucracy, pro-establishment thrust, and then in reaction to that, the New Left emerges, very suspicious. And you see sort of this, sort of an intellectual funneling where it starts with these hippies, these smelly hippies, meeting in Port Huron and writing a statement that's against, sort of a back to nature sense of re-empower the people and not the powerful. Like you see that on the left, and then it's sort of by the point of the after Watergate. The zeitgeist in the country is just entirely bought into this notion that there is a powerful elite that has run the country amok, and that the solution to that problem is restoring power to individual people, so that the highway is not run through their neighborhood, through the dirty soot-producing power plant is not put next to a school for the profit of the utilities shareholders, so that a housing development that is going to somehow devalue people's property nearby can be stopped by the people who already exist in the neighborhood. These are all notions, many of them progressive, that we are going to stop. We're going to stop the establishment in its tracks, and that then becomes the sort of the central thrust of progressivism moving forward.
And the connection to why things don't work today, just to make that explicit, is that obviously all of that becomes an obstacle to ambitious projects and any form of centralized planning, right? That because suddenly the fear becomes the ability of these big state institutions and the establishment to just run roughshod over a neighborhood or to tear down a building like Penn Station, the old Penn Station that was beautiful. The way to fight that is to make it very easy for people to litigate against building projects, is to, the destruction of Penn Station obviously is one of the seminal events in the beginning of a kind of landmark movement that, leads to a lot of buildings being protected so that you can't alter them. It's all of a kind of myriad mechanisms that spring up for legal challenges, community control, environmental laws, that have the end result of, Berkeley University wanting to expand the number of undergraduates that, attend the university, and people in the city of Berkeley saying, that might increase traffic and we're going to use environmental regulations or other things to basically block the ability of the university to do that. Or it leads to somebody wanting to build a high-speed rail line from San Francisco to LA, and the opponents of that project using environmental regulation to stop this environmentally friendly project. Is that the idea?
That's exactly the idea. The notion is that progressivism from its very birth, and this predates even the New Deal, is that progressivism has always been this awkward marriage of two different ideas. And the first idea from the very beginning has been, we have a tragedy of the common. The only way to address it is to empower some centralized bureaucracy to do it. I call that a Hamiltonian impulse. It's the sort of notion of taking power and pushing it up into the hands of some responsible figure. And then the second time, right from the beginning of progressivism, there is this notion that we should take power as it exists and return it to the people that are being coercively impacted by some, far-off monarch, regent, powerful figure who is doing something that they object to, and we should be able to make sure that the Jeffersonian landholder is able to protect his fiefdom from some coercive authority above him. And so that right from the beginning of progressivism, when people talk about the progressive movement at the turn of the 20th century, they will just sort of list the different ideas that were, that are associated with that movement. One of them is to create blue ribbon commissions so that we can do big things. That is clearly a Hamiltonian impulse to put power in the hands of experts to do big things. A second is a public referendum. Well, that's an explicitly Jeffersonian notion, that we're going to let ordinary people weigh in and make laws because we don't trust the people in the legislature to actually pursue the public interest. So from the very beginning, the movement that I associate myself with, which is progressivism, has been caught between this sort of caught unknowing. I don't think that we think about it frequently enough this way, with these two impulses, so that we see climate change today and we think to ourselves, we need to empower some bureaucracy to curtail carbon emissions. That's going to require some powerful centralized public institution to do that thing. That's a Hamiltonian impulse. And at the same time, we think about reproductive rights and we think to ourselves, what we do not want is some centralized bureaucrat telling a woman what to do with her body. That's a primarily Jeffersonian impulse. We want to return that to her personal autonomy to be able to control what happens with a pregnancy. So these two impulses have always sat side by side. What we just talked about in the late 60s, early 70s was that the prevailing zeitgeist within progressivism itself switched from Hamiltonian to Jeffersonian. It's not that the Hamiltonian impulse disappeared altogether. It's not that there was no Jeffersonian impulse during the previous era that was primarily Hamiltonian. It was that the balance shifted in that moment and we became less culturally inclined to a power like the Tennessee Valley Authority and more culturally averse to power wherever it's at. Our notion when we saw a public problem was, the problem is that there is some centralized authority that is thwarting the public will, and we need to find new tools, and you mentioned a bunch of them, environmental regulations, zoning rules, new causes for litigation, new standards, et cetera, et cetera. All of those understood separately, and too often in my mind, we don't connect them together into the cabal of tools. They really are a quiver of arrows that Jeffersonian progressivism, could use to shoot at the real shortcomings of the Hamiltonian mold.
And so your point is not that Hamilton has all the answers and Jefferson is completely wrong. To reduce it to a slogan, it's just that at the moment we're in equilibrium, that is too much Jefferson and too little Hamilton. I'm always interested in the comparative perspective, which is to say, the basic question I always ask myself is, well, if a particular phenomenon has happened in a number of different countries that I know, causes and developments in one of those countries can't fully explain that development, because perhaps theoretically it's possible that there's these convergent causes that are completely separate in each of those countries, but that doesn't seem very likely, right? If we end up getting stuck with the same inability to build things, and I hope that this book is going to get an audience, not just in the United States, but in Britain and continental Europe and other places as well, then it's likely because there are some causes that are in common. Now, as I listen to the story you give, some of it feels, quite specifically American, right? I mean, certainly the sort of mental frame of Hamiltonian, Jeffersonian can be useful in other countries as well, but obviously goes back to, a real clash of philosophical approaches, among the key figures of the American founding that in some ways, set up the original party system in the United States and has a particular resonance here. The same, I think, is true of some of the seminal figures in American urbanism. There isn't really an equivalent figure to Robert Moses that I can think of in Western Europe. Perhaps some of those similar figures existed, and there just wasn't a Robert Caro to write a great book about them, and so I just happen not to know about them. But it doesn't strike me that as much power ended up being concentrated in the hands of one kind of urban planner in quite the same way. And so I think the counter-reaction to that therefore also took a slightly different form. Now, at the same time, I imagine you're going to say, well, look, but some of the results we get are the same. I mean, you do get a kind of lefty counterculture that is very skeptical of the establishment and of institutions. You do get a desire through protected buildings and zoning laws, which are a little less extreme in Europe, but certainly exist as well, and environmental review and other things, to be able to stop things like, say, the additional runway at Heathrow Airport, which has been in debate, for decades. How easily does this story internationalize, and what does that tell us about the American story, right? I mean, if you sort of get similar outcomes in those countries, but the way you get there is a little bit different, does that mean that we need to amend a little bit how we think about the American story itself?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, as you asked me that question, my immediate reaction was to think of James C. Scott's Scene Like a State, which begins with the story of the Germans trying to regularize the layout of forests, I think, in Northern Europe, with the presumption that if you make, I think the word he uses is legible, if you make the layout of how trees are planted legible, that will improve the output of the forests, and in fact that notion of reorganizing things and sort of imposing from above a logic that makes sense to someone perceiving the world as it is from 10,000 feet, that will improve things. That's a classically Hamiltonian perspective. And Scott's book, which I think is now probably 30 years old, walks through how that notion has sort of has taken hold across the country. It he actually cites the TVA a bunch, but it is the same broad impetus that leads him, that leads people in the world of development to imagine that if they go to a poor country in the global south and they impose these standards and impose a system, that will somehow lead to inevitably to development and will be good. And he walks through, in the sort of classic Jane Jacobs sense, actually Jane Jacobs being in this, for a listener who certainly has read the Death and Life of Great American Cities, was Robert Moses's most powerful counter advocate, his scourge. The notion that there is there's an organic, that it's better to be organic, so these two ideas of a planned economy versus one embracing sort of an organic approach to growth and progress, those are, it seems to me, span certainly the Atlantic Ocean, and are presumably, even the Chinese today, who are very Hamiltonian in their approach, understand that there are trade-offs on these two fronts. And I think you're right that the balance, as the balance has shifted, the levers of bureaucracy and how things actually work in various places have shifted. But as you see, the failure of leveling up in Britain. The investing in rail to the cities in the north, presumably, I think the Labour governments or even the Conservative, the Tory governments in the post-war era of Britain might have been more effective in getting that done. And so from society to society, the arrows in the quiver of the Jeffersonian counter-reaction to big establishment power work in various ways.
First, let me do a sidebar. I rarely interrupt an episode to urgently recommend to people to listen to another episode, but I am going to do this now. I had James C. Scott on the podcast a couple of years ago. I think 2.5 years ago, perhaps, when he was already well into his 80s. He passed away last summer at the age of 86, I believe. But it's a great conversation, and James C. Scott is really, one of the most interesting social scientists of the last half century. So I strongly recommend that conversation as additional listening after you finish listening to this conversation, of course. But it's interesting that he brought up China, right? One way to challenge this account, and I think a lot of what you're saying is plausible to me and makes sense, but one way to challenge it is to say that, well, perhaps there's just an underlying shift of forces as societies and economies develop. So what you see in Germany, with the way in which the country tries to make legible and then govern its forests, as described by James C. Scott, as you see with the big Hamiltonian moment in the United States of progressives wanting to have these ambitious projects that can actually improve a nation. And as you see in China, for example, with the great, what's it called, the Freeland project, and a lot of other big attempts at infrastructure development, is that when you're relatively poor, and when the infrastructure isn't very developed, and when people desire more than anything else an increase in the standard of living, but also when there's not a lot of entrenched powers to resist those changes, because there isn't, a ton of landowners, with political power, with a lot to lose, who are going to oppose any kind of development. That's when you end up in more of what you would call a Hamiltonian mode. Right? It's just all of the incentives of a political economy are going to drive you towards, big projects that often come with very big benefits, but can also be quite disruptive and destructive in various kinds of ways. And that, again, is true whether you think about how Germans and other European nations mastered their environment, or whether you think about, Moses, building highways that improved circulation in the United States, in New York City, cut off neighborhoods and really degraded them in ways that were quite damaging, or whether you think of the kind of human displacement that is involved in some of these ambitious dam projects or other kind of road building exercises, etc. Now, as a society becomes more affluent and more complex, and particularly as there's sort of a growth of a big middle class, the political power shifts. And suddenly, the sort of prospect of future improvement becomes less important, and the maintenance of what you already have becomes more important. You have more people who want to preserve what they have, and those people have grown to be more powerful because they are educated, they have material resources to defend what they have in a way that villages that might be displaced in an earlier phase might not, right? And so you have a kind of natural tendency towards more stasis. So you only briefly invoked China. It would be very interesting to see how that develops in China, right? I think there's some good reasons to think that it's going to be a lot harder for China to build a new runway, to build a new airport, to build big new ambitious road projects in 25 or 30 years than it is today. Perhaps even if there's no significant changes to formal political structures, right? You could imagine a world in which the CCP still holds all of the power in its hands, but all kinds of political constraints suddenly mean that it's much harder for the party to displace, middle-class people in a city who've invested a lot of money in some kind of, condo apartment, than it was in the last decades to displace villagers who are, further away from the centers of power, who have fewer resources, who can speak up for themselves a lot less. So part of what we may be looking at here is, a kind of natural transition between different stages of development or different stages of a political economy.
I think that there's probably a lot to that. My sort of one pushback would be to suggest that if you look at the power, the architecture of power in the United States in the late 1800s, there is at that point, you're absolutely right that you could build the subway up through Manhattan pretty expeditiously, as they did in the early 20th century, because there was much less development in Manhattan at the time, and you could cut and cover and just sort of drive a tunnel up Broadway or between City Hall and Washington Heights. It was much easier to do, but the architecture of power itself did exist at that time to frustrate people who had great ambitions. At the time, many people believed that the machines, which represented sort of working class interests in many cases, or else the machines that represented the robber barons at the time, that they were implacable. And you couldn't do big things in America because they were so powerful, and they acted as a check against big projects. That's essentially what progressivism emerged as a response to. There was suddenly a growing middle class that wasn't satisfied with the fact that they couldn't get a better sewage system, they couldn't get clean water, they couldn't get good public transportation. There were not bridges when they wanted them. The ferry system was corrupt. There was a whole series of complaints, and progressivism emerged to say, we can do better than this. And among the things that they did was to say, the machines and the courts are inherently standing in our way, and we are going to develop a series of tools designed to chisel at both those institutions' power. So you get these reform movements that are designed, and they talk about it explicitly among themselves. They believe the courts are standing in the way, using the various doctrines from the 19th century that prevented the expansion of centralized executive power. They wanted to be able to impose a minimum wage and to create labor standards and to erect bridges and to build sewer systems. They wanted these things to be done by scientific experts, and that was an idea that again spanned across the Atlantic Ocean. Like that idea was emergent in Britain and in continental Europe, and it was happening here. And so the sort of the most remarkable change to happen in the first few decades of the 20th century is that we go from a situation that strangely enough looks a lot like today, where nothing was getting done, to one in which a whole bunch of progressives get together and begin trying to chisel away at the authority of the courts, which were, in the late 19th century, the Supreme Court was unquestionably the most powerful of the three branches of the American government, and they wanted you look at the things that Felix Frankfurter, who would eventually be appointed to the court, but when he's a young man and living in Washington, he is conspiring with his friends to embrace judicial doctrines that would give more discretion to scientific managerial types in the executive branch. And simultaneously, there are a bunch of political reforms that they are thinking about to try to winnow away the power of machines to stop progress. So this is at a moment where people are similarly frustrated today, progressivism is born to say we need to shift more power to scientific experts who can do the thing that the public needs broadly, and we can't have all of these parochial, self-interested, self-dealing, corrupt institutions running day-to-day life. And so I think you were right that there is as society becomes more complex, as more people have something at stake in preserving the status quo, it is harder to get things done. But people would have said that in 1895 or 1905 as well, that you can't break up the sugar trust because everyone now knows how much sugar is going to cost, and like the chaos that would ensue if we had real competition. Right, we are in a remarkably similar moment again, where I think more and more people, and you see this in the election of Donald Trump, are just frustrated that the institutions don't work and are trying to figure out some way to axe their way through them.
And that may be a way in which the early history of the United States is different from the early history of some other countries, where every society had to build up state capacity over time, and that was a long and difficult process. But in many places, insofar as the capacity existed, it was always quite centralized. And in the United States, the degree of decentralization was such that actually getting into that Hamiltonian mode in the early to mid 20th century was itself a kind of departure from what had been there previously, where perhaps the state might have been able to do things in a much more centralized way in the 19th century, but for the Jeffersonian reasons of how the institutions were set up, was constrained from doing so. And perhaps that really is a way in which America, especially in that early history, is a little bit different from those other societies. But I think we're starting to get into what in a way is the decisive part of this conversation. So I certainly buy the broad delineation you have of the way in which skepticism of central power in the 60s and then the 70s and 80s and so on has led to this situation where there's just so many constraints on what we can do in a centralized way that the level of our ambition has fallen and the difficulty of getting anything done has just tremendously increased. I think we can overstate the extent to which that's the case. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that the state of airports in the United States, for example, has significantly improved since I arrived here. In 2007, when I got here, we would always say, that American airports looked like the kind of third world. And I'm struck by the extent to which LaGuardia Airport in New York and LAX in Los Angeles and a bunch of other places have really significantly improved over the course of those years. So in certain areas, there can obviously still be some amount of progress. But on the whole, I think it is right that people feel deeply frustrated by the inability to make these kind of to get these kind of projects off the ground. And that's true both at the popular level and in certain kind of elite circles, right? So when you look at the kind of smart mainstream progressives today, A lot of them are coalescing not in the NIMBY movement, clamoring against things happening in the backyard, but in the YIMBY movement, saying, yes, in my backyard, yes, we do actually need to upzone, to make it easier to build more dense housing, etc. There's a whole kind of universe of the abundance movement that is coming together, where people, many from a left of center perspective, are saying, we need to be able to build a lot of housing. We need to be able to do infrastructure projects. We need to be able to do all those things, because that's going to get us to a political economy of abundance where we actually have much more affluent lives. And by the way, that's going to lead to better political results as well. So it does feel like there's a constellation right now where the pendulum seems to be swinging back, where there's more demand for, I suppose, in your concept, a Hamiltonian set of steps. The problem is that a lot of the constraints on being able to get that done are still there. Right? I mean, it's nice when, New York Times columnists go from, worrying about developments in the neighborhood to saying we should upzone. But it's a lot further to actually get that done. Clearly, as you're saying, Donald Trump ran in part on this sense that nothing in the government works, and I think it is one of the reasons why he won, and anybody who opposes him should take that very seriously. And he's being very disruptive in what he's doing in Washington, D.C., but he can't single-handedly get rid of environmental reviews either, because those are, partially the law of the land and enforced by all kinds of Supreme Court rulings that aren't going to go away overnight. So how realistic is it, do you think, that the YIMBY movement, that the abundance movement, that this new Hamiltonian moment is going to or can transform these obstacles? And what do we have to do? What changes should we advocate for if we want things to work again?
So I think that if you're sitting in America in 1895 and predicted the New Deal, you would have appeared bananas, right? Like, there's just no way that you could, like, the government was so corrupt and incompetent at that point. The federal government was tiny even at the time. The notion that the federal government would emerge to be this force in the American economy and in American lives is beyond the pale at the time. There's an incredible book, I think probably my favorite book of history ever written, Making a New Deal, by Elizabeth Cohen, which goes through how notions of what government could do in the teens and 20s evolves in the city of Chicago, of course the New Deal, so that it's a completely different paradigm by the end of the Second World War. If you're sitting in America in 1958 and seeing the power of centralized government and what it's doing and how it's remaking the American landscape, it's impossible to imagine, to your point, that it would take, imagine that 50 years later or 60 years later, it would be impossible to move a bus stop from one block to the next, right? So you're absolutely right. There is no law that Congress is going to pass and that Donald Trump is going to sign that is going to change all these things. Certain things are letter of the law. Certain things are determined by judicial precedent. The Jeffersonian reaction to the excesses of the Robert Moses era, like, are layers and they are intermingled, and it's, you really have to chisel through a lot of ossified bureaucracy to free up the discretion of anyone to be able to do things expeditiously. But that's what happens in this country, is that we toggle between being too decentralized, too wary of power, and then slowly over time things begin to free up. So there was a big movement at the end of the Biden administration to pass a permitting reform bill. I mean, we Yascha on the left need to think of some better terminology, because I think some people may fall asleep just in the middle of saying permitting reform. Just such
the only thing that's worse than that is the liberal international order.
Oh, just terrible. I mean, but we
the joke about which, sorry, is that people only like one of those three words, which is order.
Fair enough. There are certain things. There was a law passed in 1969, signed by President Nixon in 1970, called the National Environmental Protection Act, and a lot of people in this abundance, supply side, progressivism, YIMBY world are focused on that particular law, and probably narrowing its influence in how we plan big projects would be a good thing. And there's a Supreme Court case that I expect to come down in the next few months that will do something along those lines. But this is, we are in the stage where we are coming to see the problem as it is, right? Just a few years ago, we didn't understand the degree to which we, progressives ourselves, have become so inured in the idea that power is bad, that we were undermining our ability to deliver the things that people actually want. So, just the intellectual journey of having gone from being frightened of Robert Moses and seeing our political mission as ensuring that no Robert Moses figure ever walks the earth again, to one in which we say Moses did a lot of terrible things that we wouldn't want to do. Certainly he used processes that weren't fair to the people who were disrupted by his great ambitions. But we need to find some sort of balance between stopping bad projects from moving forward and allowing good, reasonable things to move forward even when there are costs. And we really, even more than centralization or decentralization, the question here is, in moments where there are trade-offs to be had, when if we build the power line that will allow us to harness a bunch of clean energy, it is possible that a rare orchid species may go extinct. Is that reason enough not to build the power line? Right now, I think that in many cases that might rise to the threshold. But these are value judgments that we need to make, and the thing that progressives have generally fought against over the last several decades is allowing anyone to make that decision. They wanted it, the perfect really did become the enemy of the good, because we created procedures designed to make sure that there were no costs to each of the project, which meant often the project couldn't go forward. All of these things are value judgments. Is the cost to lobster fishermen of putting the stanchions for new turbines off the coast of Massachusetts, is that a cost that we as a society are willing to pay? And the challenge in each case is we've created a system that allows a veto rather than provides for an opportunity for different concerns to be weighed against each other and for someone to ratify a trade-off.
Well, I would slightly also expand the way to think about those trade-offs, actually, because I think there's an immediate set of costs, and then there's a more indirect set of costs that we should take very seriously if we care about our political system. So the immediate set of costs is, are we willing to forego, the benefits of high-speed rail in California in order to, save a bunch of trees that would be felled in order to build that high-speed rail line, right? Are we willing to tolerate the inevitable costs that any infrastructure going to have in terms of some amount of disruption of local communities, habitats, and so on, in order to build that infrastructure program? And there, I think already, as you're pointing out, there's often very good reasons to build the infrastructure program, but of course, a lot of them only become visible at large scale, right? I get the instinct of saying, well, my neighborhood is lovely and nice, why do we have to change that by allowing more high-rise building within it? But of course, the systematic cost of that is that suddenly all of us are paying vast amounts of money on our housing in a way that, as we see from countries that have been better, at least in that respect, at building housing, including developed democracies in Europe, is completely unnecessary, right? The reason why I've spent some time in Hanover, New Hampshire, the reason why there's basically no single home within an hour's driving distance of Hanover, New Hampshire that costs less than $1 million is not because it's so difficult to build. Physically, it's not because there's no space. It's one of the most sparsely populated areas of a rich country anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. It's that you just have, all of those regulations and zoning laws and so on stopping people from being able to build. And we're not thinking of a kind of systematic way in which that affects all of us. That's one kind of argument, right? The second kind of argument I think is also important is the systematic risk that poses to our democracies. And I do think that whether it is in this area or in a very different context, in the case of immigration, there's a kind of legalistic argument that people make. Well, we need to respect the rule of law, we need to respect the way that these kind of procedures are done, and so that's just not on the negotiating table. There's no way around those. And I think that both misstates the extent to which the particular, of course we need the rule of law, but the particular way in which the rule of law is applied, it comes downstream from political decisions and should be up for legitimate political debate. Of course we need the rule of law. Of course people should be able to sue against building projects, but that should be only if they in fact have reasonable concerns, and those decisions should be made in a very fast way, and they shouldn't be a toolkit for just destroying our ability to act collectively. And the thing I'm trying to get at, in a slightly roundabout way, is what it does to our politics when people give up, right? And when this feeling of nothing works becomes very widespread, I think what people say is, well, perhaps we just need somebody to go and destroy the whole damn thing. And that is, I think, what we're living through right now. Now, somebody like Donald Trump is himself a strange mix of Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian. One of the first executive orders he had was to, I forget the exact details of it, but to either constrain the building of, and I think perhaps even to some extent to undo, a bunch of windmills and other kind of projects, right? So there's certainly a Jeffersonian element to his political instincts and to that political coalition as well. But I think there is also a big part of Hamiltonian appeal, right? It's to say all of these government institutions are in the way of getting anything done, and we're not going to reform them in some small ball way. We're just going to slash away at them because that's the only thing that's going to fix it now. And that political instinct is driven by that deep frustration. I'm going to do a slightly surprising analogy, perhaps, which is from the set of debates about institutional design that you have in democracies. Now, when you're worried in a country about the risk of authoritarian takeover, one thing you might think is, well, the more veto points we put up, the harder we make it for the president of a country to do anything, the more protected we're going to be against the president turning into a kind of dictator. And that was one of the logics behind the choice of semi-presidential systems, particularly in Latin America, where the president has some amount of power, but the parliament is elected independently, and in order for a law to pass, you need the assent of the parliament, so that's supposed to constrain what the president can do. Well, there's a very interesting literature, argument in the literature that may or not be fully convincing, but I think is pertinent here, to say that that's not been the result in Latin America, because what you actually got is so much political gridlock, such an inability to do things, such political fragmentation, that you invited strongman candidates to say nothing of this works, let's just bypass the whole system, because that's the only way we're going to fix things. And so I think, when we're discussing, the trade-offs, it's not just, this species of fish versus our ability to launch a rocket into space. It's also what's going to happen if that feeling of nothing works festers and metastasizes and increases, such that finally people are going to say, I'm willing to vote for anybody and to do anything to cut through this Gordian knot.
Well, I will say two things in response to that. There's two separate thoughts. The first is my book opens with a story of Donald Trump emerging on the political scene because in the mid 1980s, Ed Koch and his Parks Department can't rebuild a broken ice skating rink in Central Park, and it's over budget and years delayed. And Trump essentially says to Ed Koch, the mayor at the time, just give it to me. I will. You're putting some pipes down and some concrete. I'm a developer. I'll do it under budget. I'll do it before you can get it done. And if it costs more, I'll pay more. If it costs less, you'll get the savings. And Koch is beside himself. He hates Trump, but he agrees to do it. And sure enough, Trump does it. And the reason that Trump is able to do it and become a hero in the city momentarily is because Koch and his Parks Department have been laden with an old, well-intentioned progressive law that makes it impossible for them to build things efficiently. They have to divvy up the contracts between a whole host of different plumbing and electrical and concrete contractors, and that makes it impossible for them to coordinate. And so, that to me, the notion at the time that lots of people thought that Donald Trump, for having managed to do something successfully in New York City, deserved a ticker tape parade, even in progressive New York City in the 1980s. That's been his political game plan through and through. He's been replaying that essential strategy through his entire life, which is to say that even people who are politically progressive and reasonable see ossified, dysfunctional government and just want some strong man to come in and push through and just do the thing that we all know has to get done. None of this silliness. And he's done that on the national stage now. So that more than anything else is his political identity. So I respond to I absolutely think that this feeling that nothing works is the reason that we have MAGA, right? That it opened the door and ushered in the frustrations of ordinary people that government isn't working. So all these institutions have made terrible calls, can't get anything done, sent us into the Iraq War, let the bankers have their bonuses after the financial crisis. It's clearly corrupt. Let's move in a new direction, and that's what Trump represents. The second thing I'd say to what you said, which is what happens when people feel as though the institutions don't work, this is the quintessential American experience. The Articles of Confederation were the original governing doctrine of the newly independent United States, and that was too decentralized. That was a Jeffersonian document. The governing doctrine of the United States didn't work. The states couldn't raise money. They couldn't build for national defense. They couldn't do international treaties. There were all sorts of things. And when there was an uprising in Massachusetts, it was almost impossible for they needed federal intervention. The Congress didn't have the authority or the ability to put down the rebellion. So the Constitution was a reaction to this same frustration. We're in an Articles of Confederation moment by some mechanism. We have so devolved centralized authority to these veto points and these various bureaucracies that are all tied up that we are thinking to ourselves, do we need to blow the whole thing up? That doesn't mean that I think we need a constitutional convention, but we have repeatedly seen in American history moments where we've swung too far to the Jeffersonian hilt, where it's impossible to do things. Then we've moved too far to the Hamiltonian, where we had Robert Moses mowing down huge neighborhoods at the inconvenience often of minority and poor communities. We are constantly negotiating this balance between these two impulses. And we are at least now between NIMBYism and supply-sideism and abundance and this whole new thinking on the left. We are at least recognizing that the impulse that we had that was emerged from C. Wright Mills and the Port Huron and Abbie Hoffman and Robert Caro in the 50 and 60 years ago, that those were well-intentioned reforms those were the impulse that they imbued in progressivism to be wary of centralized authority, to try to shave down the establishment, to create new leverage for people who were going to be bulldozed literally and figuratively. That was in the realm of the good, but that it's gone too far, and you need to have some balance. And like, to me, I don't think we're looking at needing to overturn the government. But we should, rather than spending our time, as you've written, rather than spending our time screaming about what Donald Trump is doing, we need ourselves to think about, if we are the movement for government, if the Democrats are the party of government, is government delivery? Or like a refrigerator company that is delivering refrigerators that don't keep the chicken cold, like, do we need to think about the sort of the actual mechanics of the institution that we support? I hope that Trump, I don't think that he's going to dismantle our democracy. I certainly hope not. I think we should hold him accountable. But I think we need to spend more time thinking about the product that we're selling. Is progressive actually working for people? And if it's not, are there things that we can do ourselves? There's an element when I make this argument to people that say, Trump is the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room, just focus on him, all the things that he's doing. We just need to scream louder at people until they realize that he's a racist or a xenophobe or whatever, that he's a crook. That hasn't worked for us. That strategy hasn't worked politically, and I think that's because by focusing on that, we're not focusing on ourselves. I am saying, and I think that the YIMBYs and abundance folks are saying, there are things that we should be advocating for that are different from the things that we've been advocating before, not because we're giving in to Trump, but because we ourselves have an interest in seeing government work. And we need to, like, the sort of the blessing of this is we don't have to spend our time thinking about Trump. Like, there's stuff that we can begin thinking about, plans to create a mechanism so that we can choose when and how to do high-speed rail at an affordable rate. How do we metabolize the local opposition to a housing project when we know that we need housing generally? How do we figure out which infrastructure projects to do, and how can we do it more affordably so we can have more of them? All of those things, like those are things that we haven't thought about in our obsession with our concerns about Donald Trump, and these are things that we can control, or at least we can begin to plan for, because the country does not want a dictatorship. Like, there's going to be a moment, I hope, and I feel very confident, that we will have an opportunity to govern again. And when we are there, we need to prove that government does work and can work.
Marc Dunkelman, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.